You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Today we're asking, what's the point of the Commonwealth? The organisation contains 53 mostly former British colonies with a total population of about 2.2 billion people and has the Queen as its head. Membership is growing, with Rwanda and Mozambique recently joining. Yet critics argue the Commonwealth does not live up to its stated aim of promoting democratic values and instead confers legitimacy on governments accused of abuses. The condemnation has increased in volume following the recent Heads of Government meeting in Sri Lanka, where the government is accused of killing thousands of civilians during its military victory over the Tamil Tiger rebels. Canada and India's prime ministers boycotted the event, while Britain's David Cameron chose instead to visit the Tamil minority. Yet Sri Lanka's leader, Mahinda Rajapaksa, simply accused Mr Cameron of hypocrisy. The Commonwealth also offers development assistance and runs scholarships, an athletics tournament and a literary prize. But is that enough to justify its existence? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Tom Peck, a journalist at The Independent, Professor Philip Murphy, Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and Harry Phibbs, a Conservative journalist and councillor for the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. And on the line we have Mark Stevens, a lawyer and president of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. So, thanks very much for joining me. I wonder if we might start just by asking Professor Philip Murphy to give us a sort of brief history of the Commonwealth, if you like, and perhaps you could describe how its purpose has changed over the years.
Okay, people will tell you that the Commonwealth started at a particular date, and none of the dates really make sense. It's evolved over a very long period of time. The word Commonwealth is first banded around to describe parts of the self-governing empire in the 1880s. In the interwar period, the system of consultation starts to be formalised with the Balfour Report and the Statute of Westminster in 1931. But what really changes is in 1949, when an independent India remains in the Commonwealth, and it's enabled to remain as a republic simply by the virtue of recognising the King, George VI, as the symbol of the free association of Commonwealth members and as such head of the Commonwealth. So that's often taken as the genesis of the modern Commonwealth. And the nature of the Commonwealth thereafter changes with the process of rapid decolonisation. So in the interwar period, it's frankly it's a white men's club. It's a group of white settler colonies. With India, the character, physically, ideologically changes. And in the 1950s, 1960s, where you have an influx of newly independent states from Africa and from the Caribbean and from Asia, it changes again. And so by the early 1960s, I suppose the British government itself doesn't quite know what to do with the Commonwealth. But that purpose, the question, what's the Commonwealth for, is answered by this incredibly charismatic generation of independence leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and they say that the purpose of the Commonwealth is to complete the process of decolonisation where it's stalled, and it's stalled in southern Africa, in southern Rhodesia and in South Africa. So the crusade, if you like, against apartheid becomes the great unifying issue. It becomes the great mission of the Commonwealth. It's a bit uncomfortable for British governments, particularly for Conservative governments in the 1970s, 1980s. But it gives the Commonwealth a sense of momentum. And ironically then, when South Africa moves to a properly representative government in the 1990s, it's a huge victory for the Commonwealth. But it also loses some of that sense of direction. So the Commonwealth tries to reinvent itself as an organisation supporting supposed values of democracy, human rights, freedom of speech. But it's never quite given it that sense of purpose that it had before. And of course, because its members are so diverse, because there are so many, defaulters in terms of those values, frankly, it struggles really to have a sense of coherence and a sense of mission anymore, I think.
Do you think it's in crisis?
I think it is. I think it possibly in terminal crisis.
Tom Peck, terminal crisis, the Commonwealth. Do you agree with that?
To answer that question, you have to ask from what position you're coming from. The Commonwealth, by and large, exists as a friendly son of what was once an empire. Now, there are certain people who, especially in Britain, who love the Commonwealth, but they are, by and large, the type of person who are very pro-monarchy, who get very gushy and very excited by these stories we hear of the crown jewels being flown to Sri Lanka and all the Commonwealth Cups being lined up. But to ask whether or not it's in crisis, you have to ask what is it supposed to be doing? And it does have a clear purpose, which it set out earlier this year, which is to promote democracy, to promote civil rights. And you can say it's not succeeding in those missions because of what's happened in Sri Lanka this week. But actually hosting that conference was a nightmare for Sri Lanka because a lot of attention was drawn to the terrible things that have happened there. Now, the Commonwealth, unlike the UN, still has the power to throw people out. It monitors elections. It does quite a lot of good things. Quite what its remit is, yeah, that might have declined somewhat. So you could speak of that in terms of crisis. But it still is having some success in some important measures for some countries who need what it can offer.
So should it continue to exist, in your opinion?
Well, it's a voluntary organisation, so it will continue to exist for as long as its members want to be members of it. I think there will be something of a sea change when the Queen is no longer with us. But given that there are lots of countries that want to join, like Mozambique and Rwanda have just joined, who have no part of our history, of it, were never part of the British Empire, it will continue to exist for as long as people want to be a member of it.
Harry Phibbs, what do you make of the Commonwealth? Is it a force for good, or is it in terminal decline?
Well, it is a force for good. I think it is a force for trade and prosperity and for democracy and human rights, and it stands up for those ideals. And obviously we can have a lot of discussion about how successful it is. But I don't recognise what Philip was saying about it being in decline. I'm puzzled by him saying that because it's a club where that people are queuing up to join. And it's already a pretty big club. It covers 2 billion people, a third of the planet. And we used to think of these as poor countries. Increasingly, they're becoming richer. There's economic growth. We talk about all this trouble we've been having in many countries about recession. They've got very impressive rates of economic growth, sort of 20% and so on. And increasingly, these countries that were thought of as developing countries, really we're going to have to say are developed and are becoming very effective trading partners. And so instead of it being this old-fashioned nostalgic thing about the hangover from the British Empire and the Queen and so on, which obviously all that history and the role of the Queen is important for Britain's role in it, I think we've got to say that it's become adapted to the modern world. And David Howell has written a book about this called Old Links and New Ties, and he makes the point that in the modern world, networks are more important than blocks. And so in many ways, the Commonwealth is particularly well suited for globalisation and the direction that things are going in. So I think it's going to thrive and grow. I don't see it as in crisis at all.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're asking, what's the point of the Commonwealth? Joining me are Tom Peck, a journalist at The Independent, Professor Philip Murphy, Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Harry Phibbs, a Conservative journalist and councillor for the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and Mark Stevens, a lawyer and President of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. Mark Stevens, is the Commonwealth in terminal crisis, or is it thriving and growing, in your opinion?
Well, it's thriving and growing, and I think one has to also frame this in terms of what is it that underpins it. And I think we've already said, the Commonwealth Charter, which the Queen and everybody signed last year, is obviously a critical point in it and is obviously the way forward. But let's step back a bit. Part of what we get from the Commonwealth, part of what the Commonwealth gets from us, if you like, is the common law. It is the values that underpin our legal system, that underpin the legal systems of every Commonwealth country. And as a result of that, they're able to import laws and reviews of laws that we do in this country and indeed other countries do, and we can learn from one from the other. And it's as a result, it is a peculiarly useful organisation. So you may find that particular countries are ignoring the rule of law, and Sri Lanka is an obvious case in point, Zimbabwe may be another. But it does give you the opportunity, if you are a citizen of one of those countries, to make a reference point back to the Charter of Fundamental Values and also back to the rule of law, the common law, which was, if you like, the greatest bequest that we gave to these countries when they were former colonies. They're now independent, and the individuals within those states have a right to exercise their rights independently. And I think that what we're able to do is to telegraph from the Supreme Court here in London, the Privy Council, which is the ultimate court of appeal for many of the Commonwealth countries, the sort of values that we see in a civilized society. And many of them adopt them with alacrity. And we see countries that have been in crisis, like countries like Rwanda, who have applied recently and been admitted to join the Commonwealth. They do have a history with us, but it was a brief and fleeting history. And as a result of that, they look to us for those sorts of values in that post-crisis period.
Mark, isn't it important that also the Commonwealth is willing to throw people out? I mean, Zimbabwe you mentioned, but Zimbabwe's thrown out. Fiji is thrown out. And the United Nations are much softer about this than the Commonwealth. I think you could say with the United Nations that it is just rhetoric about human rights. They don't actually apply minimum standards. But I think the Commonwealth do. The Commonwealth are prepared to be much tougher about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we have an unfortunate leader in the Commonwealth at the moment, in the Secretary-General, Sharma, who is sort of the ultimate diplomat and therefore tends not to take a position of principle on much, as most old-fashioned diplomats don't. We saw that was why the Canadians were so very cross at not knowing about his legal advice that what was going on in Sri Lanka was in breach of the law and was inappropriate, and they feel that they should have been told that. And so I think part of the crisis, and I think there is a bit of a crisis, it would be, frankly, facile to suggest there's not, but that part of the crisis is about the leadership, it's about the individuals rather than the Commonwealth itself. The Commonwealth itself is in rude health. What it needs is a bit of vision, a bit of leadership, and I think if anyone had had any sense about Sri Lanka, they would have said, look, things going on there are pretty bad, and as long as they're in default of a UN resolution to have a proper investigation and account for the allegations of war crimes that took place in that country, then in those circumstances, I don't think that we should be suggesting in any way, shape or form that Rajapaksa should be the leader for the time being of the Commonwealth. That just seems to me to be run counter to all the values that we have. But we are where we are.
Tom Peck.
A tremendous lot of attention was brought upon Sri Lanka by the fact of all those leaders going there, David Cameron going there, so many journalists going there, that would not have been the case had they simply been thrown out. And if the end that you're trying to achieve is to make that country a better place and make Rajapaksa accountable for what happened in 2009, actually what's happened this week and last week is a far better way of doing it than any other.
I don't think that's right, actually. I think that, there were small victories. For example, the British government said, we're not going to go unless you allow Channel 4 News, who'd been covering in very great detail the inappropriate behaviours and atrocities in Sri Lanka. But this was a problem that was being covered fairly extensively. And I think if people had gone to Mauritius, which was the alternate venue posited, then in those circumstances, I suspect there would have been an enormous amount of global media attention on why that was. And I think also countries like Australia, which don't want boat people from Sri Lanka, wouldn't have taken the highly politicised stance that the Prime Minister from Australia did of spending most of his time cozying up to Rajapaksa in the hope that he wouldn't have the domestic problem of boat people.
Professor Philip Murphy, you want to come in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to slightly qualify, but also maybe defend my grim prognosis. I mean, as Mark suggests, there isn't a single Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth has outlived a lot of obituaries in the past. There are kind of overlapping circles. There are networks, as we've heard. There are kind of traditions of legal practice. There are cultural affinities. There's the English language. I mean, I was asked recently about a rumour that Burundi wanted to join. Why does Burundi want to join? Partly because they see the English language as the international language, and the international language of trade as much as anything else. And, they see the Commonwealth as the main Anglophone organisation in the world. So, as a term of art, the Commonwealth is likely to be around for a very long time in one form or another. Also, there are countries queuing up to join. And you've got to remember that the majority of Commonwealth states are what we define as small states. When the British Empire broke up, it created an awful lot of very small, not very viable and rather poor states. And, the Commonwealth has been described once as the aftercare service of the British Empire. And for leaders of those countries to be able to take part in a major international forum on equal terms with some of the big hitters from the G8 and the G20, it's incredibly important to them. So in that respect, there will be enough satisfied customers probably for this thing to roll on for a little bit longer. But the question is, as an international organisation, as it's currently configured, is it working? And the answer is no. I mean, the Commonwealth's biggest state, India, in which the majority of Commonwealth citizens actually live, was not represented by its Prime Minister, partly because he was under domestic pressure, but frankly because India for decades hasn't really cared very much about the Commonwealth. They see it as a rather old-fashioned thing. They see themselves in a completely different position in the 21st century as a regional and potentially global superpower. The Canadian government didn't turn up. The British Prime Minister turned up, but really just to dig himself out of the hole that the Secretary-General had dug for him in terms of... And Mark is absolutely right. And we've, at the Commonwealth Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the moment, we are running a major oral history project on the Commonwealth since 1965. And frankly, the key finding so far is that everything comes down to leadership, and a very personal sort of leadership. Sonny Ramphal, between 1975 and 1990, okay, he was Secretary-General in interesting times, but he had a kind of charisma, he had a drive, which really made that organisation noticed in global affairs. Emeka Onyuku, who followed him, a very different sort of character, but with extraordinary integrity and vision. And we lack this at the moment. And without effective leadership, the organisation just feels as though it's in free fall. And those of us who do care about it just despaired when, at the last Heads of Government meeting, they confirmed this decision to hold the next CHOGM in Sri Lanka, because everyone knew.
I think that's absolutely right, if I may. I mean, it just ultimately the glue that is holding the Commonwealth together at the moment is the Queen, because she is so revered by everyone. I think Charles will take that position perfectly comfortably, but it should also be the heads of government, and I think, and also the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. And I think, you're absolutely right when you say from Sonny Ramphal onwards, we've had absolutely exceptional leadership within the Commonwealth, and we do have a problem today. And I think the heads of government now recognise that, and I wouldn't be surprised to see what's politely called a reshuffle in the not too distant future. And I think that the heads of government understand that they're going to need a strong leader of the Commonwealth to make that transition.
Who would you like to see, Mark? Who would you like to see as the leader of the Commonwealth?
I think there's immense numbers of people out there who have integrity and could do the job. I mean, off the cuff, Kofi Annan is an obvious person who would do it. Whether he would take it over, having already done the UN, is another matter. But it's got to be someone of that kind of caliber and who's sort of recognised in international affairs as a person of affairs and who can lead.
Philip Murphy, would you have any suggestions for the next leader?
I have loads of ideas, but I wouldn't want to embarrass them by mentioning them by name. Can I just say something about the position of the Queen? I think it's quite interesting, and I've got a book coming out next month about this very subject, about her relationship with the Commonwealth. What's so interesting is in the 1970s, when, again, the Commonwealth seemed to have a sense of momentum, a real sense of purpose. Actually, the position of the Queen, although personally there was a huge amount of affection for her, that position of the British monarch being head of the Commonwealth, people were beginning to feel a bit uncomfortable about it, because it did seem to kind of reinforce this misguided image of the Commonwealth as the British Commonwealth, and as a sort of throwback to imperialism. In the last 20 years, Commonwealth leaders have really been foregrounding the position of the Queen as head of the Commonwealth, because they know that she's almost the only newsworthy thing about the Commonwealth. And this was particularly apparent in the Jubilee year last year as well. And the problem you then have is that, of course, the post isn't hereditary. So this is something that will have to be managed when the Queen finally passes away. And frankly, it will create a problem because there isn't a mechanism to do it. And when the transfer took place the last time a monarch died, the Commonwealth was a much smaller and very different sort of organisation.
Yeah, and it comes back to that sole question about leadership that we have at the moment, and the vacuum we have at the top of the Commonwealth at the moment, which is where I think we all agree the crisis lies at the moment.
Tom Peck, I want to ask, does the Commonwealth need its sort of branding as an organisation promoting progressive values, if you like, or can it function quite happily as a sort of trade club?
I think it's very important that it promotes progressive values. I think that is, on the trade front, yes, that is its saving grace in the sense that its members, if you look at Africa today, in general, where there is stability and the chance of prosperity is in the former British colonies that are now members of the Commonwealth. If you compare that to, say, Congo or France, are possibly about to send troops into the Central African Republic. So in that role, in the sense of the Commonwealth as being something which is empire aftercare, I quite like that term, then trade is very important to that. But it certainly has an obligation to promote to promote those values that it restated last year. On the subject of leadership, that's quite interesting because I would imagine 95% of people who are of those 2.2 billion members of the Commonwealth wouldn't have a clue who the leader of the Commonwealth is. I think they imagine it to be the Queen. If that leadership is not working and needs to be redone, then so be it. But certainly it should definitely be about more than just a trade club. Otherwise, its function really has expired.
Isn't there a link, though, between the trade and the values and human rights and so on, in that if you're an international investor, I see it as a kind of kite mark, that if a country is a member of the Commonwealth and there are certain minimum standards in terms of the rule of law and democracy and human rights, that's a reassuring prospect for you, as this is a country that you can trust, you can do business with, rather than it being some kind of gangster state with some vile dictatorship where you'd feel uncertain about. So I think that one of the reasons why countries want to be in the Commonwealth is that they want to have that respectability. I think they enjoy the networking and meeting other leaders and certainly and meeting the Queen and so on. But it's also got a practical benefit to their trade and investment, having that
Harry Phillips, India, for example, is in the Commonwealth. It's also in the BRICS organisation of countries, which includes Russia and China and big economic powerhouses. I mean, which do you think is more important for India?
Well, it was said if you can't ride two horses at once, you shouldn't be in the circus. There's a bit of a danger of trying to present this always in terms of saying we should either do this or do the other. I mean, for Britain, the Commonwealth is absolutely consistent with us having a close relationship, special relationship with the United States, and perfectly consistent, whether we think it's a good thing or not to be members of the European Union is another issue, but there's no contradiction, and I don't think there is for India in their relationships. And actually, in terms of Britain, if we look at the Foreign Secretary William Hague and the visits he's made, the bilateral visits to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, but also many other Commonwealth countries, there's been far greater emphasis on relations with Commonwealth countries than there has been with his predecessors. So in many ways, in Britain, the shift, rather than it sort of being a nostalgic thing that's being gradually sort of forgotten about, the emphasis has increased.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're asking, what's the point of the Commonwealth? Professor Murphy, Mr. Rajapaksa just simply said, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones when he was referring to Mr. Cameron's call for, more concentration on human rights concerns. I mean, what can you do with that?
Yeah, well, this is another of the problems with the Commonwealth. The British government often talk about it as a soft power organisation, and that's often a sign that a government doesn't quite know what to do with something when they call it that. Because you know what sort of soft power is in terms of the American government sponsoring an exhibition of abstract expressionism in the 1950s or 60s. It's saying these are American values, artists are free, so this work really represents what we stand for. Okay, well, maybe in the case of the Commonwealth, having those values, having that statement of values says the British government are supporting, and they are the major funder of an organisation that promotes these values, which are our values. But it starts to look a little bit silly when it can't follow through and enforce them. And the problem with doing that in the context of something which is the bare bones, really, transformed of empire, is that when the British government tries to exercise any kind of leadership through the Commonwealth, states that are out of line just turn around and say, what about the Indian Mutiny? What about Mau Mau? In fact, from the point of view of promoting human rights and democracy, the British government might well find it easier to do so through, say, the United Nations than through something which is ultimately the kind of spectre of their former empire.
Tom Peck.
On the charge of hypocrisy, and Rajapaksa saying, well, who are you to say that? It's largely a non-point in that I don't think there can be any doubt that any country that is symbolically tied to Britain in the world's perspective in 2013 will find it a lot harder to commit the sort of acts that possibly allegedly happened in that country. I think British people's relationship with being in the Commonwealth is very much symbolically tied to British people's relationship with the monarchy. And there was a period in the 1990s where outside all of these Commonwealth heads of government meetings were Republican protesters. In the last decade or so, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, it's rather gone the other way, and we're very pro-Republican now. If the Commonwealth's job is empire aftercare to guarantee human rights, prosperity in all of the member states, if there is a period in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, 40 years' time, where we've succeeded in that mission, then you do have to question what the Commonwealth's point is. And it may be then that Britain will withdraw, but I can't see it outliving Britain's membership. I think if we withdraw, that would be its purpose done, so to speak.
I just want to go through all of our guests very quickly and just ask, in a nutshell, what will it take to revivify the Commonwealth, if you like? Mark Stevens.
I think it's got to be about leadership in the post of the Secretary-General, and once that's done, I think that we're going to see a very smooth transition from the Queen to the next leader of the Commonwealth.
Harry Phibbs.
Well, I think Mark had talked about transparency, and I think that there will be, for all countries, including Commonwealth ones, greater transparency, and that is something that the Commonwealth should back up, that information about what countries are doing, and the Secretary-General certainly should have a role in terms of holding countries to account and giving them, if you like, an early warning before actually throwing them out if there are these abuses. And the Commonwealth should be tougher, it should raise its standards, and it can afford to, because it's in a strong position. Lots of countries wanting to join. It can afford to be tough and maintain high standards with its membership.
Philip Murphy, can the Commonwealth be saved?
Well, sure, it's partly about leadership, but it's also about the Commonwealth trying to define just 2 or 3 things it can do effectively. At the end of this Heads of Government meeting, it released one of its characteristic communiques, almost self-parody, 94 different kind of good causes that it's subscribed to, from fighting cyberspace crime to piracy, sustainable development, about which it can do very little indeed. It's got to define 1 or 2 things it can do well.
And Tom Peck, finally, wither the Commonwealth.
Well, I think the Commonwealth will only revivify and has a true role to do when its member states behave abominably. So in that sense, one has to hope that it doesn't.
That was Tom Peck, a journalist at The Independent. I was also joined in the studio by Professor Philip Murphy, Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and Harry Phibbs, a Conservative journalist and councillor for the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. And joining us on the line was Mark Stevens, a lawyer and president of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. Thanks very much. Where the government is accused of killing thousands of civilians during its military victory over the Tamil Tiger rebels. Canada and India's prime ministers boycotted the event, while Britain's David Cameron chose instead to visit the Tamil minority. Yet Sri Lanka's leader, Mahinda Rajapaksa, simply accused Mr Cameron of hypocrisy. The Commonwealth also offers development assistance and runs scholarships, an athletics tournament and a literary prize. But is that enough to justify its existence? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Tom Peck, a journalist at The Independent, Professor Philip Murphy, Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and Harry Phibbs, a Conservative journalist and councillor for the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. And on the line we have Mark Stevens, a lawyer and president of the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. So, thanks very much for joining me. I wonder if we might start just by asking Professor Philip Murphy to give us a sort of brief history of the Commonwealth, if you like, and perhaps you could describe how its purpose has changed over the years.
Okay, people will tell you that the Commonwealth started at a particular date, and none of the dates really make sense. It's evolved over a very long period of time. The word Commonwealth is first bandied around to describe parts of the self-governing empire in the 1880s. In the interwar period, the system of consultation starts to be formalised with the Balfour Report and the Statute of Westminster in 1931. But what really changes is in 1949, when
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Today we're asking, what's the point of the Commonwealth? The organisation contains 53 mostly former British colonies with a total population of about 2.2 billion people and has the Queen as its head. Membership is growing, with Rwanda and Mozambique recently joining. Yet critics argue the Commonwealth does not live up to its stated aim of promoting democratic values and instead confers legitimacy on governments accused of abuses. The condemnation has increased in volume following the recent heads of government meeting in Sri Lanka.
The Caribbean and from Asia, it changes again. And so by the early 1960s, I suppose the British government itself doesn't quite know what to do with the Commonwealth. But that purpose, the question, what's the Commonwealth for, is answered by this incredibly charismatic generation of independence leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and they say that the purpose of the Commonwealth is to complete the process of decolonisation where it's stalled, and it's stalled in southern Africa, in southern Rhodesia and in South Africa. So the crusade, if you like, against apartheid becomes the great unifying issue. It becomes the great mission of the Commonwealth. It's a bit uncomfortable for British governments, particularly for Conservative governments in the 1970s, 1980s. But it gives the Commonwealth a sense of momentum. And ironic, independent India remains in the Commonwealth, and it's enabled to remain as a republic simply by the virtue of recognising the King, George VI, as the symbol of the free association of Commonwealth members and as such head of the Commonwealth. So that's often taken as the genesis of the modern Commonwealth. And the nature of the Commonwealth thereafter changes with the process of rapid decolonisation. So in the interwar period, it's frankly it's a white men's club. It's a group of white settler colonies. With India, the character, physically, ideologically changes. And in the 1950s, 1960s, where you have an influx of newly independent states from Africa and from